for that introduction, Jason. It's a great honor to be here. I'm very excited, and thank you very much for your warm welcome to myself and to my husband Lawrence. It's wonderful to have so many kind of relatives here, actually. I've discovered half the room is related to me in some way. But as Jason said, this book is not just about Iraqi Jews. I tried to cover all the communities of the Arab world. I did not really write about Iran because why did I not do so? I don't know. I think it's because the exodus of Jews from Arab countries was the great exodus, and it happened around the same time as the establishment of the State of Israel. And the exodus of the Iranian Jews happened much later. I mean, there were Jews who left Iran around 1948, 1949, but they were a minority. And it wasn't until 1979 and the takeover of the Ayatollahs that there was a mass exodus of Jews from Iran as well. So, as Jason mentioned, this book grew out of my blog, Point of No Return, which some of you may be familiar with. There are copies of the book back there on the table. If you've been browsing a copy and you don't want to buy it, please put it back on the table. If you do want to buy it, I think there is someone who's actually selling books. Yes, this gentleman at the back there. And I'd be very happy to dedicate your copy for you afterwards. So as I mentioned, the book grew out of a blog. It's been going about 13 years, this blog, Point of No Return, and it covers Jews from Arab and Muslim countries. And you just have to Google Point of No Return blog and you can get to it. My other activity concerns Harif, which some of you may or may not have heard of. It's the British equivalent of Jimena, which is the very active group in California that represents Jews indigenous to the Middle East and North Africa. We sort of run on parallel tracks, if you like. In Britain, we organise talks, film screenings, debates, everything to raise the profile and raise awareness of the history and culture of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. And it's a very important thing to do because in Britain, as in America, the community is by and large Ashkenazi. And the Sephardim and Mizrahim are quite a small minority. So we've got an education job to do, within the Jewish community, never mind the outside world. And it's been quite a struggle because there's very few of us. There's about 4 volunteers running Harif. But in the last 10 years or so, we like to think we've made progress. We're sort of penetrating into the heart of the Jewish community, and we hope that eventually the mainstream will get to know about Sephardim and Mizrahim as well. Why did I write this book? As Jason mentioned, I do have a personal interest insofar as my parents were Iraqi Jewish refugees. They left Baghdad in 1950. Unlike the vast majority of Jews from Iraq, they did not go to Israel and they came to the UK. My father had personal reasons for coming to the UK, and that's why we ended up there. While I was growing up, the story of the Iraqi Jews sort of haunted me, if you like, because we still had family stuck in Baghdad. I had my 4 grandparents were still living there in the 60s. And of course, when Saddam Hussein took over and he started his reign of terror, we were desperately worried about our relatives back in Baghdad, and they were unable to leave. And one of my relatives was my Aunt Marcel, who in fact, her family, her 3 children, were living in England. She was a widow, and she made the decision to go back to Baghdad to sell some property. And then she found herself unable to leave and was trapped in Iraq for 6 years. And her grandson is sitting over there in the second row, Alex. And eventually she did leave illegally, what the Iraqi Jews called Kachar. There was a whole wave of emigration from Iraq through the Kurdish mountains. These people were smuggled with the help of the Kurds, and I think with help from Israel as well, into Iran, which then was friendly to Israel. And that's how almost 2,000 Jews got out of Iraq in the very early 1970s. So that's one reason why I felt very connected to Jews from the Middle East, even though I myself was born in England. The other reason is that the story of the Jews from Arab countries is neglected. In fact, it's almost unknown. It's an untold story. There have been memoirs that have been coming out. Some of them have been pouring out, as refugees get to a certain age and they look back at their roots and they want to write down their stories. And so there's been quite a lot of that sort of thing. But there hasn't been very much written about Arab countries in general, about Jews, about communities in general. I think the first person to write a book on this subject and make it accessible to the mainstream was Sir Martin Gilbert, the late lamented British historian. And he brought out a book in 2010 called In Ishmael's House. And he was really the first person to put Jews from Arab countries on the map, Jews from Arab and Muslim countries. Since then, there's been quite a lot of work done, mainly by French historians. I don't know if any of you have heard of Nathan Weinstock, Georges Bensoussan, Paul Fenton, who actually is British but is a professor at the Sorbonne, Batior, whose books actually have been translated into English. So there's a very small group of historians who sort of specialize in this subject. So what I've tried to do here, I make no pretensions to be a historian or an academic. I'm a journalist, but I assembled material from my blog. And of course, I started reading a lot about this subject. I've got a whole bookshelf full. And so the result is this book, Uprooted. Now, the central event of the book really is this massive exodus of 850,000 Jewish refugees from Arab countries. A greater number than Palestinian Arab refugees, and the largest movement of non-Muslims until the mass exodus of Christians after the American invasion of Iraq. So an absolutely catastrophic exodus, because it was very sudden in many cases. It was forced, and these people left against their will. Of course, the story has a happy ending because most refugees are very happy where they ended up. And very few people would want to go back to these countries that remain as as awful as they were when the Jews were forced to leave them. On the other hand, it's important to recognize that these Jews did leave against their will. They were uprooted from their homes. Some of these communities had been there a very long time. The oldest communities go back 3,000 years. And it's important to recognize this fact, and it is very important, it's central, in fact, to the understanding of the Middle East conflict. And yet, the story is hardly ever mentioned.
That's right.
So, just to give you an idea of the figures, you can see these were very old communities that go back before the Christian era, in most cases. You can see what a dramatic decline occurred between 1948 and 2016. Those are the latest figures I've got. And these communities have been reduced to extinction. They're really extinct, or else you can count the numbers of Jews on the fingers of one or two hands. And in the case of Algeria, in the case of Libya, and in the case of both of those, there's no Jews at all. These communities are extremely ancient. For instance, the Iraqi Jewish community goes back to biblical times. It goes back to the first exile after the destruction of the first temple, when the Jews were taken from Judea as slaves and ended up in Babylon. And this is a community that's been in continuous residence in Babylon. Ezekiel's tomb is one of the 5 prophets. I think Ezekiel is one of the 5 prophets who are buried in the region. And Iraq and surrounding area has almost more Jewish history, or as much Jewish history, as the land of Israel. It's an astonishing thought, isn't it? And Ezekiel's tomb used to attract something like 5,000 Jewish pilgrims. Were coming up to Shavuot. They would visit at Shavuot and other times of the year as well. And those pictures show you what it looked like inside the shrine. There were inscriptions in Hebrew and rather beautiful decoration. And the picture on the left shows Jewish scribes there standing outside the shrine. Obviously they're ready to write prayers for the pilgrims or whatever. And now, of course, it's been transformed into a Shiite shrine. It's almost unrecognizable, although the actual chamber where Ezekiel's buried, still it has been preserved, we think. As far as we know, the original decoration is still on the walls. But of course, what they've done is they don't talk about Ezekiel. It's a Muslim prophet who's buried there, and they've changed the story completely. And this is what has happened to Jewish heritage in the Arab world. It's been appropriated, or it's been erased. So let's look back and look at the reasons for the Exodus. I mean, people tend to link the Exodus to 1948, which is the date when Israel was established, and they almost make a causal link. They say, oh, well, it's because Israel was established that all these Jews had to leave. But I would argue that the root causes of the Exodus actually go back in history, and you have to consider the 14 centuries. Do come in. Hi. More relatives. You have to consider the 14 centuries during which Jews and Muslims lived together. When I say live together, people talk about coexistence, which assumes a sort of that they existed on equal terms. But of course they didn't, because under Islam, non-Muslims, specifically Jews and Christians, are dhimmi. And that means, what does it mean? Can anyone explain to me what a dhimmi is?
Guest. It is a person under the protection of the supervisor.
That's right. And why is he under the protection? What does he have to do to be under the protection?
He needs to pay the jizya willingly.
Exactly. Right, so he actually has to pay a tax.
And he cannot build above
That's
the highest
right.
building.
That's it. So there's a host of rules and regulations.
Could you repeat the answers? We couldn't hear the answers.
Yeah. The answers were, as the gentleman said, the dhimmi has to pay a tax. In other words, he has to subcontract his right to self-defense to the ruler. And the other aspect of the dhimmi status is that there's a whole host of restrictions on the dhimmi. For instance, his house cannot be higher than the house of a Muslim. He can't build a, that's right, he can't ride a horse. He can't build new synagogues. He can't repair old ones. And of course, his testimony is not valid. It has not got the same worth as that of a Muslim in a court of law. So basically, a dhimmi does not have the rights of a Muslim. Now, the dhimmi status began to be undermined in the 19th century when the Western powers started making inroads into the Ottoman Empire. And a very strange phenomenon happened. The European colonial era, yeah, I think you recognize some people there. That's Auntie Marcel, your grandma. The dhimmi status actually became reversed in the 19th century because the European powers, the British and the French, insisted that the dhimmi status be abrogated and that non-Muslims should become equal citizens with Muslims. Another interesting phenomenon was the advent of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, which was a schools network that was set up by a group of well-meaning French Jews who wanted to educate the benighted Jews of Arab countries, prepare them for the modern world, and basically give them the skills to survive. And this was a great success, so much so that the Jews became the backbone of the colonial administrations when the British and the French and the Italians took over in the Arab world. The result was the Jews were getting all the best jobs and the Muslims were left behind. So this was the start of a rift between the communities. And this rift became wider and wider. And you can then see that all this did not just occur in 1948 with the establishment of Israel, but there are pretty deep roots behind this rift. The colonial era was a golden age. So I'm talking about the early 20th century here. And the Jews really thrived in the Arab world. They contributed a huge amount to all aspects of the economy and culture, music, for instance, famous singer called Salim Halali in Algeria. This lady here, Camellia, was a famous film star in Egypt, and I've got her on my front cover. Her real name is Liliane Levy-Cohen, and she made something like 18 films between the ages of 17 and 21, when sadly or tragically she was killed in a plane crash. Rumor has it that she was the mistress of King Farouk, and he had her bumped off, but we don't know if there's any truth in that. Other examples of famous musicians and singers, the Al-Kuwaiti brothers in Iraq. The Jews really dominated music in Iraq. The Baghdad Broadcasting, the radio orchestra had 250 members, and only 3 were Muslim. And that wasn't because the Jews were any more talented or anything like that. It's because I think there was a fatwa in the 19th century against Muslims actually playing music. So of course the Jews stepped into the breach, and they had a school for the blind, so they taught blind Jews how to play music, so at least they could support themselves. And it was a golden age. But of course, it came to an end quite quickly with the rise of anti-Semitism. Now, you can't deny that there was colonial anti-Semitism, notably the French in the Maghreb were in control there. There were protectorates in Morocco and Tunisia, and in Algeria. Algeria was really part of France itself, and the Jews had been granted French citizenship. But the local French, who were called the Pieds Noirs, were very resentful of the Jews in Algeria, and there was quite a lot of anti-Semitism from the white colonials there. And this pamphlet on the left, La France Juive, was produced by Edouard Drummond, who was actually the member of parliament for Algiers, the member of the French parliament. And there were riots that were actually incited against the Jews by the French colonials. Concurrently with colonial anti-Semitism, we had Arab and Muslim anti-Semitism. But I should say, I forgot to tell you about the colonials, that although the colonial powers had granted equal rights to the Jews, there was a limit to how far they would go to protect them, for instance. And in the Second World War, of course, we saw what happened when the Vichy governments moved into the Maghreb. They stripped the Jews of their rights. They forced them back into the ghettos of Moroccan cities. They chucked them out of professions and of schools. And this was the colonials who'd given the Jews their rights equally were capable of stripping them of them. And of course, had Rommel not lost the Battle of El Alamein in 1942, the Jews of North Africa were probably going to be exterminated along with everyone else. So there was also another aspect of colonial rule, and that was whenever there was trouble against the Jews, the colonial powers were not necessarily prepared to intervene to stop the trouble. We have a very good example in Iraq with the Farhud, which was a massacre of Jews in 1941. And there the British Army stood at the gates of Baghdad and refused to intervene. The same thing happened in Libya in 1945, when the British soldiers there who were in control of Libya were sent back to their barracks, and 130 Jews were killed there. This was just after the war. And there are other examples too. We move on to Arab and Muslim anti-Semitism. With the rise of Arab nationalism, there was a sort of blood and soil nationalism that began to marginalize the non-Muslim communities. So you had, for example, in Egypt, the Jews were not allowed to become Egyptian nationals, or they had to prove that they'd been in Egypt for so many generations before they could get an Egyptian passport. And other minorities had this problem, like for instance the Armenians were not given Egyptian nationality. And there's this gradual marginalization of non-Muslim communities. They were first excluded from political life, from public life, and kind of edged towards the exit. So that was one form of anti-Semitism. And of course, Nazism had a great influence on that nationalism. You had the rise of parties like the Ba'ath Party, which were established on the Nazi model, and some still exist today. Well, Assad is the head of the Ba'ath Party in Syria, and there's also the Syrian National Socialist Party or something that still exists. And of course there were paramilitary youth organizations and that sort of thing on the Nazi model. Then there was Muslim anti-Semitism, and by that I mean the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928. An Egyptian called Hassan al-Banna founded the Muslim Brotherhood. And the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood had at its core anti-Semitism. The Jews, of course, were hated because of what was happening in Palestine, but there was another reason, and that was they were at the forefront of modernity. And the Muslim Brotherhood wanted to roll back modernity. They wanted the Jews and women, they wanted them to be submissive. They didn't want them to be liberated in any way. And they wanted to re-establish the caliphate that had been abolished with the Ottoman Empire, when the Ottoman Empire ended. So the Muslim Brotherhood imported this sort of European anti-Semitism, or even Nazi anti-Semitism, ideas of Jewish power and conspiracy. And this was actually quite alien to the traditional Muslim view of the Jew, because the Muslims viewed the Jews as being basically quite harmless. They weren't really a threat. They'd been defeated by the Prophet Muhammad. But they were too stubborn to really see the light and convert to Islam. And of course, they needed to be just tolerated, as long as they knew their place. So what happened in the early 20th century was this Nazi ideology was imported into the Arab world and is still with us today. And you only have to read the Hamas Charter to see, ideas of Jewish conspiracy, that the Jews started World War I, the revolution, French Revolution, and all this sort of thing. And those are ideas imported from Europe, and specifically, I'd say, from Nazism. There was a three-way alliance between the Muslim Brotherhood, the Germans, who were very active in financing the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Mufti. Of course, the Mufti, Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Palestinian Mufti, was a key figure in fomenting anti-Semitism. And you see him here having his famous meeting with Hitler in November 1941. And he was actually a guest of Hitler for the rest of the war. And from Berlin, he broadcast Nazi propaganda against the Jews of the Arab world. Before he arrived in Berlin, of course, he was instrumental in inciting the Farhud, that terrible massacre of 180 Jews in Iraq in June 1941. And in fact, he can be credited with inventing a new kind of anti-Semitism that combined elements of anti-Jewish hostility in the Quran, for instance, the anti-Jewish verses you find at the end of the Quran, and he combined it with this Nazi anti-Semitism, theories of Jewish power. And you can see, or you can hear Mahmoud Abbas making his speeches, and it sounds like, like he's not, and that nothing has changed, really.
Nothing has changed.
Sorry, what have I done? Lawrence. Oh.
I
didn't know what I did.
No.
No.
Right.
I just have to
Sorry.
exit.
Excellent. That's it.
Let's just take that out, I think.
Yeah, that's it. So the Mufti had plans to exterminate the Jews of the Arab world and of Palestine. And the meeting with Hitler was really to get Hitler's authority for the Mufti to be in control of the extermination project when the Nazis became victorious, when they won the war. There is this myth that the Holocaust did not touch the Jews of the Arab world and the Middle East, but of course the Farhud is an example of a Nazi-inspired massacre, because the Mufti was a pro-Nazi, and all the people who conspired to overthrow the government and put in its place Rashid Ali al-Gilani, who was a pro-Nazi. They were all sympathetic to the Nazis. So that was a Holocaust event. And in fact, survivors of the Holocaust can claim compensation from the Israeli government because it was a Holocaust event. The Holocaust did affect the Jews of North Africa. For instance, there were labor camps set up in Algeria, Morocco. In Libya, there was a particularly nasty camp called Jado, where thousands of Libyan Jews were sent, and 600 died of typhus and starvation. In Libya too, the Libyan Jews who actually had British nationality were deported to Bergen-Belsen, and that is not very widely known. But I think most of them did survive, and the picture at the top there shows Libyan Jews actually returning to Libya after the war. And you can see there's a Union Jack, and it says to Tripoli. Yeah. Right. Right, so the big question is, what came first, anti-Zionism or anti-Semitism? I mean, people tend to blame Israel for the spoiling what was a very good relationship between Muslims and Jews. But I think I've already given you some kind of examples of trouble that occurred before 1948. And this is one example, which is the pogrom of 1912 in Fez. in Morocco. So 1912, well before the establishment of Israel. And in fact, not many people know this, but Morocco is one of the worst records for pogroms if you look at the history. Although today it has a very different image. So, in 1948 then, when the war broke out with Israel, 7 Arab League countries declared war, and they immediately turned on their Jewish citizens in a sort of second war. So they were waging the war against Israel, the Zionists in Israel. They were waging a second war against their own Jewish citizens, who in fact had nothing to do with Israel. They were minding their own business in all the Arab countries. They were non-combatants, but the Arab governments took their revenge on their own citizens, and they implemented a series of discriminatory laws against their own citizens, whom they called the minority of Palestine, the Jewish minority of Palestine. And we know now that they drafted a law to discriminate against their Jews even before Israel was declared. And one of the things they did do, obviously, was strip their Jews of their citizenship. And you see here a laissez-passer, which has a stamp on the left-hand side that says, no return. You're not allowed back in the country. And I've got the original one here, which we picked up in Israel. So there was a mass exodus of Jews from Arab countries following the establishment of Israel in 1948. In fact, 90% of the Jews of Yemen, Iraq, and Libya left within 3 years of 1948. And the rest, 90% left within 15 years of 1948. So it was a massive exodus. In addition to being stripped of their citizenship, they were stripped of their property. So this is an example of a very grand villa owned by a Jewish family in Egypt, which is now the Swiss embassy in Cairo. And nobody knows quite how much the Jews lost in terms of property confiscated or seized, but we know it is many times what the Palestinians lost in Israel. Now, what happened to these Jews once they'd left the Arab countries? Well, most of them, that's 650,000 of them, went to Israel. And Israel only had 600,000 people anyway, so it doubled its population virtually overnight. And Israel was a struggling country. It didn't have any resources. It couldn't feed these refugees. It couldn't house them. It didn't have jobs for them. It had to put them in these tent camps. So many of these refugees ended up in tent camps or ma'barot, and some of these tent camps stayed in existence for 13 years or so. I mean, there were not just tents, but there were wooden huts or tin huts, which of course became very, very hot in summer. These camps were really not very sanitary. The roof of the tents and the huts leaked when it rained, and it was really terrible. And of course, a lot of the refugees who came from Iraq, for instance, they wrote to their families who were still in Iraq and said, "Don't come." So the question is, why did we not hear about the refugee issue, the Jewish refugee issue? And one reason is that Israel didn't talk about it. And one reason why Israel didn't talk about it is because the Ashkenazi establishment, if you like, it wasn't their story. So this is an artwork by a Mizrahi artist called Mir Gal. It's called 1 in 400, I think it is. It shows how few pages were dedicated to Mizrahi history in a textbook, a school textbook, right? So the story of the Jews from Arab countries, their story and their heritage were not told in Israeli schools. All this has started to change recently. Just a minute, let's go back again. The Israeli government passed a law in 2010 saying that there could be no peace agreement with the Arabs unless there's compensation for Jewish refugees, right? So it has to be included as part of a peace settlement. Also, there have been efforts to change the school curriculum in Israel so that the history and heritage of Jews from Arab countries is taught. Also, there is now a day in the calendar. We've got the 30th of November, which is marked every year in Israel and around the world by organizations like mine, Harif, where we commemorate the Exodus. We also celebrate the culture, the very rich culture of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. And of course you can see now in Israel today that it is a Middle Eastern state in terms of food and culture. And in a way the Mizrahim dominate, even though they're still perhaps not in certain fields in academia or in the media, but they are very influential, and there's a sort of cultural backlash from the old Ashkenazi elite. You know, they don't really like it. They find it rather vulgar. They don't like Miri Regev, the new cultural minister in the Netanyahu government, and that sort of thing. So there is a sort of cultural war going on in Israel today. But the Jews from the Middle East and North Africa are now over 50% of the population. So they're not some, marginalized minority. They are the majority in Israel, and they are making their mark on the country. So I just want to leave you with one thought, which I put in my book, and that is the Jews are not people from outside the Middle East. They are indigenous to the Middle East. They have a right to self-determination. Israel is their ancestral homeland. And they are one of a mosaic of different ethnic and religious groups that also consider the Middle East and North Africa as their home. For instance, the Berbers, the Assyrians, the Kurds, the Copts. I met a Syrian Kurd last week at the 70th anniversary party for Israel in London, and he said to me, we've been waiting since 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne, for a state of our own. And just to say that the Jews were not the only ones promised a state after the end of the First World War. The Assyrians were promised a state. What happened to it? They never got it. The Kurds were promised a state. They never got it. So the Jews were lucky that they managed to achieve their self-determination. And this is not an anomalous situation in the Middle East. It should be the norm, that different peoples in the region should be entitled to have their own state. And the Jews, in fact, were lucky enough to achieve theirs. So I'll finish there. I'm sure you've got questions.